Good morning, students. Welcome back. I hope all of you are safe and fit at home, studying well, and completing your work on time. This is our chapter number 9, and the name of the chapter is The Great Stone Phase 1. It is written by the famous writer Nathaniel Hawthorne. This is my lecture number 1 for the same chapter. This chapter is taken from Honeydew book. Students, we shall cover this chapter in one lecture only. Topics to be covered in today's lecture are, first of all, we shall read the objectives of the chapter. After then, introduction of the chapter. Then, explanation of the chapter will be done line by line of part 1 and 2 along with word meanings. At last, homework will be assigned. Students, before start reading the chapter in detail, first of all let us see the objectives of it. Number 1. To enable the pupils to develop the skills of reading, writing, listening and understanding. Number 2. To expose the students to the new terms and their uses. Number 3. To make the students draw comparison between the good and bad persons. Number 4. To allow the students to learn how to become a great person. Now let us read the introduction of the chapter. The Great Stone Phase 1 is a story that tells us about a man named Ernest who resides in a valley. It is an ordinary town with a specialty. In other words, it has got a local mountainside that has rocks. These rocks are put together in such a manner that they resemble a very wise and benevolent face from far. This face fascinates Ernest a lot. His mother tells him a story of a local legend. She says that a man who resembles the great stone face will return to the valley. This makes Ernest more interested in finding out about the man. In part 1 of the story, we learn about his quest to find the great stone face. Ernest is always in the hope that someone resembling the stone will appear one day. Definitely, thus, it tells us about his search for the man and his experiences throughout the same. The story is divided into two parts. Seen from a distance, hilltops and huge rocks seem to assume various shapes. They may resemble an animal or a human figure. People attribute stories to these shapes. Some stories come true, others don't. The great stone face is one such shape that reminds the inhabitants of the valley of a prophecy. What was it? Did it come true? To know about this, let us read the story of the chapter The Great Stone Phase 1. One afternoon, when the sun was going down, a mother and her little boy sat at the door of their cottage, means hut, talking about the great stone face. They had only to lift their eyes, and there it was plain to be seen, though miles away, with the sunshine brightening all its features. Means, one fine afternoon at sunset, a mother and her little son sat outside their hut as they discussed the great stone face. It was so big that it only required them to lift their eyes to be able to see it. Although it was miles away, it could still be seen clearly as the sunshine falling on it enhanced all its features. And what was the great stone face? Means, if you may ask, what really was the great stone face? The great stone face was a work of nature, formed on the perpendicular side of a mountain by some immense rocks. Perpendicular means cliff or rock face, rising very steeply. Immense means huge. Means the great stone face was a piece of art made by nature on the perpendicular side of a mountain by the nature piling up of some huge rocks, which had been thrown together so that when viewed at a proper distance they resembled the features of a human face. Means the rocks were piled in such a good way that when looked at from a particular distance it seemed like a human face. But if the spectator approached too near, he lost the outline of the enormous face. Spectator means onlooker or watcher. Enormous means very big. And could see only a heap. Heap means pile of gigantic. Gigantic means immense, huge rocks piled one upon another. Means but if the onlookers were to look at it from too close, they would lose the outline of the great stone face and would only see a pile of giant rocks. But seen from a distance, the clouds clustering means gathering about it. The great stone face seemed positively to be alive, and it was the belief of many people that the valley owed much of its fertility to this benign face that was continually beaming over it. Benign means kind or gentle. Means surely when looked at from miles away as the clouds gathered around it, the great stone face looked alive. Many people believed that the fertility of the valley is also because the kind and gentle face was constantly smiling over it. A mother and her little boy, as we said earlier, sat at the door of their cottage, gazing. Gazing means look steadily, especially in admiration or thought, at the great stone face and talking about it. The child's name was Ernest. Means a mother and her little son, as was mentioned in the story earlier, sat outside their cottage staring at the great stone face and talking about it. The son's name was Ernest. Mother, said he, while the great stone face smiled on him, I wish that it could speak, for it looks so very kindly, that its voice must indeed be pleasant. If I ever see a man with such a face, I should love him very much. Means, as the great stone face smiled over him, Ernest described his desire to his mother to hear the great stone face talk. He thought that a man with such a kind appearance must have a very pleasant voice. He further expressed if he would ever find a man that looked like the great stone face, he would love him dearly. If an old prophecy. What is the meaning of prophecy? Means statement that tells what will happen in the future should come to pass, answered his mother. We may see a man sometime with exactly such a face as that. Means his mother replies and tells him that if an old prophecy were to come true, there may be a day where a man will come who will look exactly as the great stone face. What prophecy do you mean, dear mother? Eagerly inquired Ernest. Please tell me about it. Upon hearing this, Ernest questions his mother about the old prophecy. So, his mother told him a story that her own mother had told her when she herself was younger than little Ernest, that at some future day a child should be born near here who was destined to become the greatest and noblest person. Noblest means having or showing fine personal qualities or high moral principles of his time, and whose face in manhood should bear an exact resemblance to the great stone face. Many still had faith in this old prophecy, but others took it to be nothing but idle talk. Idle talk means foolish or irrelevant talk. At all events, the great man of the prophecy had not yet appeared. Means, upon being asked, Ernest's mother told him the narrative that her mother had told her when she was even younger than little Ernest. It states that at some point in the future there would come a day when a child born near the place would look exactly like the great stone face upon becoming an adult. He would be destined to become the greatest and most selfless man of his time. Majority of the population's faith still lied in the prophecy, while others considered it irrelevant. Whichever may be the case, the great man being talked about in the prophecy had not appeared till that time. "Oh, mother!" cried Ernest, clapping his hands above his head. "I too hope that I shall live to see him." Means, upon hearing this, Ernest clapped his hands above his hands, since he was filled with hope. His mother was an affectionate and thoughtful woman. Affectionate means loving or caring. It was proper, she thought, not to discourage the fanciful, means over imaginative or unrealistic hopes of her little boy. So she said to him, "Perhaps you may," means he told his mother that he wished to live long enough to see the noble man. Being a loving and thoughtful woman, his mother did not wish to discourage him, even though his hopes were a bit unrealistic. Thus she replied, "Perhaps you may." And Ernest never forgot the story that his mother told him. It was always in his mind whenever he looked upon the great stone face. Means, since that day, Ernest always remembered the story his mother told him and would always think about it whenever he looked at the great stone face. He spent his childhood in the log cottage where he was born. He was dutiful. Dutiful means doing everything that should do to his mother and helpful to her in many things, assisting her much with his little hands and more with his loving heart. Means during his childhood, he stayed in the log cottage where he was born. He was responsible and loyal to his mother. He would help her in doing a lot of things with his little hands and loving heart. And in this manner, from a happy yet often pensive. Pensive means thoughtful. Child, he grew up to be a mild and quiet youth. Means he was very obedient yet thoughtful as a child. As he grew up to be low key and quiet in his youth. Ernest had no teacher, but the great stone face became one of him. When the work of the day was over, he would gaze at it for hours until he began to imagine that those vast features recognized him and gave him a smile of kindness and encouragement. Means Ernest never had a teacher, so the great stone face acted as one in his life. Each day after winding up his work, he would stare at the great stone face for hours until he began to think that those immense features recognized him and smiled at him kindly. This encouraged him. About this time, there went a rumor throughout the valley that the great man who was to bear a resemblance to the great stone face had appeared at last. Means around that time a word was spread across the valley that the great man from the old prophecy that before resemblance to the great stone face was about to make his appearance. It seems that many years before, a young man had left the valley and settled at a distant seaport. Means quite a few years earlier, a young man born in the valley had settled at a distant seaport to become an established shopkeeper. Gather Gold, which was his name. He set up as a shopkeeper and being sharp in business matters, had become so very rich that it would have taken him 100 years only to count his wealth. In time he thought of his native valley. He decided to go back there and end his days where he had been born. Means his name was Gathergold and he had very good business skills. By that time, Gathergold had become so rich that if he began counting his wealth, it would have taken him 100 years to do so. At that time, he thought of coming back to the valley as he wanted to spend his last days where he was born. Ernest had been deeply stirred by the idea that the great man, the noble man, the man of prophecy, after so many ages of delay, was at length to be seen in his native valley. While the boy was still gazing up the valley one day and imagining that the great stone face returned his gaze, the noise of wheels was heard and a crowd of people cried, "Here comes the great Mr. Gathergold." Stirred means arouse strong feeling in someone. Means upon hearing this, Ernest was extremely moved at the idea of seeing the greatest and noblest man from the prophecy in his native valley. One day, when Ernest was staring at the mountain, imagining that the great stone face looked back at him, he heard the noise of wheels as people announced that the arrival of the great Gathergold. A carriage drawn by four horses dashed. Dashed means here stopped forcefully. Round the turn of the road, within it, thrust partly out of the window, appeared the face of an old man with yellow skin. Means the noise of wheels were made by the carriage in which Gathergold arrived. The carriage, being drawn by four horses, was stopped with force around the turn of the road. One could partly see the face of an old man with a yellowish skin tone from the open window. The very image of the great stone face, shouted the people. Sure enough, the old prophecy is true. Here we have the great man at last. Means the people started shouting in excitement that the man exactly resembled the great stone face and that the old prophecy was indeed true now, that they have the great man in the valley. And what greatly puzzled Ernest. They seemed actually to believe that here was the likeness which they spoke of. He turned away sadly from the wrinkled shrewdness of that unpleasant face and gazed up the valley where the stone face seemed to say, "He will come. Fear not, Ernest. The man will come." So, here the meaning of shrewdness is the quality of having or showing good powers of judgment or sharpness. Likeness means the fact or quality of being alike, means resemblance. Means Ernest was unable to understand how people actually believed that the man resembled the great stone face like it was said in the prophecy. He got disappointed and turned away from the wrinkled, clever, and unpleasant face of the old man. He stared at the valley where he could imagine the great stone face, asking him to have patience as the man in the prophecy will come. Now let us read the story of part 2 to know about what happened next. The years went on and Ernest grew to be a young man. He attracted little notice from the inhabitants. Inhabitants means people living in the valley. Of the valley. They show nothing remarkable. Remarkable means worthy of attention or extraordinary in his way of life, except that when the labor of the day was over, labor means work, he still loved to gaze upon the great stone face. Their idea was that this was a folly. Folly means lack of good sense, foolishness, but pardonable means able to be forgiven because Ernest was industrious. Industrious means diligent and hardworking, kind and neighborly. Means a few years passed by, Ernest grew up to be a young man. He was not very famous amongst the people living in the valley. He lived a very simple life, and the people of the valley found nothing extraordinary which was worthy of their attention in his lifestyle. Only one thing drew their attention towards him, that after finishing the day's work he would still stare at the great stone face. People thought that it to be his foolishness, but also considered it to be excusable because Ernest was diligent, hardworking, kind, and also a good neighbor. They did not know that the great stone face had become a teacher to him, and that the sentiment which was expressed in it would enlarge the young man's heart and fill it with deeper sympathies. Sympathies means feelings than other hearts. They did not know that from this would come a better wisdom than could be learned from books. Means the people were unaware that the great stone face acted as a teacher in his life. They did not know that the sentiment which was expressed in it would expand earnest heart and fill it with emotions like sympathy deeper than others' hearts. The wisdom that he acquired from it was better from what any book could teach, and the people of the valley were unaware of it. Neither did Ernest know that the thoughts which came to him so naturally in the fields and at the fireside were of a higher tone than those which all men shared with him. Means, even Ernest himself did not know that the thoughts which came to him so naturally in the fields and at the fireside were much more complex and superior than what others like him had. A simple soul, simple as when his mother first told him the story. He beheld means saw, the marvelous means extremely good or pleasing, face looking down the valley. He still wondered why its human likeness was so long in coming. Means a simple and uncomplicated soul as he counted to be, like he was when his mother first told him about the old prophecy. He still retained his extremely pure and good looking face that looked down at the valley, trying to reason why it is taking so long for the human embodiment of the great stone face to come. By this time, poor Mr. Gathergold was dead and buried. His wealth, which was the body and the spirit of his existence, had disappeared before his death. Since the melting away of his gold, it had been generally agreed that there was no great likeness after all between the ruined merchant and the majestic face upon the mountain. Majestic means having or showing impressive beauty. Means by that time, Mr. Gathergold, who was considered to be the man in the old prophecy, died and was buried. Before he died, he lost all his wealth, which was considered to be the main essence of his existence, as all of his gold melted away. The people of the valley came to the realization that there was actually no resemblance between the ruined merchant and the magnificent beauty of the great stone face. It so happened that another son of the valley had become a soldier many years before. After a great deal of hard fighting, he was now a famous commander. Means then came the news of that one of the previous inhabitants of the valley became a soldier many years ago. After a lot of struggle and fighting, he rose to the rank of a commander who was quite famous. He was known on the battlefield by the name of Blood and Thunder. Old and tired now, he had lately expressed a desire to return to his native valley. Means, in fact, on the battlefield, he was known by the name of Blood and Thunder. As he grew old, he desired to return to his native valley. The inhabitants, his old neighbors, and their grown up children prepared to welcome the renowned commander. Renowned means famous, means the inhabitants, his old neighbors, and their grown up children began the preparations to greet the acclaimed commander. It was being said that at last the likeness of the great stone face had actually appeared. Means a word also spread across the valley that the great likeness which was spoken of in the prophecy had appeared. Great, therefore, was the excitement throughout the valley, and many people who had never once thought of glancing at the great stone face now spent much time in gazing at it, for the sake of knowing exactly how General Blood and Thunder looked. Means the valley grew excited, and even those who had never even thought of looking at the great stone face before began spending hours looking at it, just to anticipate how General Blood and Thunder actually looked like. On the day of the general's arrival, Ernest and all the other people of the valley left their work and proceeded to the spot where a great banquet had been prepared. Banquet means feast. Means on the day of General Blood and Thunder's arrival, everyone, including Ernest, left their work early to gather at the place where a feast had been prepared to welcome the general. Soldiers stood on guard, flags waved, and the crowd roared. Ernest was standing too far back to see Blood and Thunder's face. However, he could hear several voices. Means to greet him, soldiers were made to stand on guard. Flags were waved and the crowd shouted in excitement. Ernest stood far away and could not see the generals himself, but he surely could hear several voices. "It is the same face, exactly," cried one man, dancing for joy. "Wonderfully like it, it is a fact," replied another. "And why not?" cried a third. "He is the greatest man of this and any other age, beyond a doubt." Means one man claimed that the general had the exact same face as he danced in joy. Another said it for a fact that he looked wonderfully like the great stone face. A third voice could be heard saying that he is undoubtedly the man from the prophecy, as he is the greatest man of all ages. Ernest at last could see the general's face, and in the same glance to the side he could also see the great stone face. If there was such a likeness as the crowd proclaimed here means said loudly, announced, Ernest could not recognize it. "Fear not," Ernest said his heart, as if the great stone face was whispering to him. "Fear not, Ernest, he will come." Means by that time or by that moment, Ernest managed to glance at the journal's face in a way that he could also see the great stone face beside him. Ernest could not find any resemblance between the two, like the crowd announced, but at the same time he could hear his heart tell him not to worry, as if it was the great stone face itself telling him that the man will come. So, this was your story. Students, you have to complete your homework on the basis of the chapter explained by me. And your homework is read chapter 9, that is the Great Stone Face 1, and write word meanings mentioned in the video. Based on the understanding of the chapter, write the answers of the questions mentioned in the book Honeydew as. Page number 130, working with the text, question number 1 to 5. These questions you have to do in your English Fair notebook. Students, you have to write the meanings of the following words in your English Fair notebook. First word is immense. Second is enormous. Third is renowned. Fourth is industrious. Fifth is dashed. Sixth is steered. Seventh is pensive. Eighth is proclaimed. So now let us see questions of working with the text, which is on page number 130 in your book. Question is, answer the following questions. Question number 1, part 1 is, what was the great stone face? Part 2, what did young Ernest wish when he gazed at it? Question number 2 is, what was the story attributed to the stone face? Question number 3 is, what gave the people of the valley the idea that the prophecy was about to come true for the first time? Question number 4, part 1 is, did Ernest see in Gather Gold the likeness of the stone face? Part 2 is, who did he confide in and how was he proved right? Question number 5 is part 1. What made people believe General Blood and Thunder was their man? Part 2 is, Ernest compared the man's face with the stone face. What did he conclude? So, that's all for today. This is the end of the lecture. Students, if you like our videos, then please hit on the like button and don't forget to subscribe our channel. Thank you and have a nice day.